Imagine a world where your voice is stolen from you, not by illness, not by fate, but by something darker. Something that binds you to a person in a way that no one else can understand. A world where silence isn't your choice, but your sentence. This is the haunting story of June and Jennifer Gibbons, twins who shared an unbreakable bond. A bond that would lead them down a twisted path of silence, madness, and an unspeakable pact. Born in Barbados on April 11, 1963, the Gibbons twins seemed like any other set of children, but when they were just a few years old, their family moved to the quiet, isolated town of Haverford, West Wales. Far from the vibrant life they had known in the Caribbean, the twins were thrust into a foreign world of cold streets and even colder stares. It was here, in the shadows of a small town, that something unnatural began to take shape. June and Jennifer retreated from the world around them, cutting off communication with everyone, even their family. But the true terror didn't begin until they made a pact of silence. And what followed was a story that would haunt their lives, and ultimately the lives of those who dared to look too closely. A world without words. As they grew older, their silence became something deeper. At first it seemed like a temporary phase, a strange quirk that would pass. But it didn't. June and Jennifer refused to speak to anyone, not even to each other at first. They would only communicate in quiet, secretive glances. But soon even that would change. By the time they were in elementary school, the twins had become completely silent. They would sit side by side in class, not speaking a word to the teacher or their classmates. Their refusal to interact with the outside world became a source of intense concern. Yet there was something more terrifying than their silence. The way it seemed intentional, calculated, as if they were communicating something far beyond the understanding of those around them. No one could make sense of it. Were they afraid? Were they hiding something? Or had they simply made a decision to shut the world out entirely? Their parents, desperate for answers, took them to a series of doctors. The diagnoses varied: autism, severe trauma, selective mutism. But nothing explained the depth of their silence. It wasn't just that they didn't speak. They wouldn't even make eye contact. It was as if the very presence of another person was an affront to their existence. The twins existed in a bubble of their own, untouched by the outside world. And yet within their silent realm, something dark and twisted was growing. They began to develop their own language, an indecipherable code that only the two of them understood. They created worlds, stories, and fantasies, but all of them were framed by a single chilling theme: isolation. A world where no one was allowed in. They had shut the world out. But what would it take to break through? What would it take to make them speak? A pact written in silence. As the years passed, the twins' bond grew stronger and more dangerous. Their silence was no longer simply about isolation. It became something darker, something that held them together in a way that was almost unnatural. Then, at age 14, during a routine psychiatric evaluation, the twins finally revealed the terrifying truth behind their silence. They had made a pact of silence that bound them in ways that no one could comprehend. They had promised each other that they would never speak to anyone else. Not to their parents, not to their doctors, not to anyone. In their minds, breaking the pact meant death. Not just any death, but a specific, unthinkable one. One twin would die if the silence was ever broken. This was their truth, their unspoken law, their pact, and they were determined to keep it. But what could have driven them to such extremes? A fear that lived deep inside them? A fear that their silence was the only thing keeping them alive? Or was it something more? Something darker? Their bond was now inseparable. The only person they could trust was each other. The only voice that mattered was the one they shared. But in this silence, something terrifying was growing. They could no longer exist in the world outside. No one could. Not unless they were willing to break the pact. And that was unthinkable. As their bond deepened, their behavior grew more erratic. They began to live in a world of their own creation, a world where reality and fantasy blurred together in unsettling ways. And their pact, once a whispered promise, became a prison, one they could not escape. The final consequence. As the years wore on, the world grew increasingly concerned. June and Jennifer were no longer just quiet. They were unpredictable, unstable. and the psychological tension between them began to escalate. In 1981, the twins were placed in a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, but instead of getting better, their condition seemed to worsen. The doctors couldn't find an explanation for their extreme behavior. They had become almost feral in their silence, retreating further into their own minds. They would not speak to the doctors, and when they did speak, it was to each other in their strange private language. Their obsession with the Pact grew. The fear that one of them would die if they broke the silence consumed them. It was clear now, and their bond was not just psychological. It was as if the silence had become a living thing, wrapping itself around them and choking out all possibility of escape. In 1993, after years of tension, the unthinkable happened. Jennifer, the more fragile of the two, fell suddenly ill. Her body, which had been slowly unraveling under the weight of their pact, could no longer withstand the pressure. She was rushed to the hospital, but by the time doctors arrived, it was too late. Jennifer passed away that night, leaving June alone with the pact and the consequences of breaking it. Jennifer's death sent shockwaves through June. The pact had been fulfilled. The silence had come at a terrible cost. The very thing they had feared had happened. Jennifer had died. And now June was left to face the reality of a life without her sister. A life where the silence remained, deafening and endless. But could it really be the pact that killed Jennifer? Or had the bond between them gone so deep that the fear of breaking it had become a self-fulfilling prophecy? The legacy of silence. After Jennifer's death, June was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. But the silence, the pact, would never leave her. She would later speak about the bond she shared with Jennifer, about the pact that had controlled their lives. But the grief was too much. The silence between them remained, an eternal echo in her mind. For years, June lived in solitude, haunted by the memory of her twin. She never truly recovered from the loss. It was as though the silence had become part of her soul, a presence she could never escape. Her own mind seemed to reflect the madness of the pact, a pact that had ultimately consumed them both. June would go on to live a quiet, reclusive life, but she was never free from the shadow of the pact. It weighed heavily on her, even as she struggled with the psychiatric condition that had defined her life. The psychological scars of her bond with Jennifer were permanent. In 2019, June Gibbons passed away at the age of 56. She had lived through years of torment, caught in a silent world of her own making. But the story of the silent twins, the story of their pact, their isolation, and the consequences of their madness, lives on as one of the most unsettling mysteries of the human mind. What drives two sisters to seal their fates in silence? Was it madness? A deep-seated psychological condition? Or something far darker? A pact written in fear, in isolation, and in a bond that no one could understand? Was Jennifer's death the result of a broken pact? Or was it the inevitable outcome of a life lived in silence? Drop your theories in the comments below. Do you think the pact was real, or was it just the manifestation of a fractured mind? Was their silence a choice, or was it something more sinister? If you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because sometimes the most dangerous bonds are the ones we make in the deepest corners of our minds.